This is how the narcissist hypersensitizes the target of their abuse, thus engineering emotional reactivity in their chosen victim. Most people assume manipulation begins with deception. They imagine lies, gaslighting, or outright intimidation. While these behaviors certainly exist, they may not represent the deepest level of psychological influence. The more profound question is whether manipulation can change not only what a person believes, but how their nervous system responds to the world itself. What if the goal is not simply to control another person's thoughts? What if the goal is to gradually reshape their emotional threshold until they begin reacting to situations that once would have passed unnoticed? Within psychology, this possibility leads us to a fascinating concept known as sensitization. When viewed through the lens of narcissistic relationship dynamics, sensitization offers one possible explanation for why some people emerge from these relationships feeling chronically anxious, emotionally reactive, and constantly prepared for the next conflict. Before exploring this idea, it is important to make a distinction. Hypersensitization is not a formal diagnosis, nor is it unique to narcissistic relationships. Human beings become sensitized in many different environments. Combat veterans may become sensitized to loud noises. Children raised in unpredictable homes may become sensitized to changes in facial expressions or tone of voice. Victims of repeated bullying may become sensitized to criticism long after the bullying has ended. Psychology has long recognized that repeated emotional experiences can alter the way the brain detects and responds to future events. The question explored in this essay is whether certain relationship dynamics may intentionally or unintentionally accelerate this process. One of the earliest psychologists to demonstrate this principle was Ivan Pavlov. Although his work focused on conditioned reflexes rather than complex human relationships, it revealed something fundamental about learning. The nervous system does not merely react to events. It learns from patterns. Experiences that repeatedly occur together gradually become linked until one begins to predict the other. Over time, the body starts responding before the event itself has fully arrived. Anticipation becomes almost as powerful as the experience. This principle extends far beyond laboratory experiments. Human beings are constantly learning emotional associations. A particular expression may come to signal disappointment. A certain tone of voice may predict criticism. Silence may become associated with rejection. Even the sound of footsteps approaching a room may trigger anxiety if those footsteps have repeatedly preceded conflict. None of these responses require conscious thought. They emerge because the nervous system has become highly efficient at detecting patterns connected with emotional survival. Behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner expanded this understanding by showing how consequences shape future behavior. Actions that are rewarded tend to increase, while actions followed by unpleasant consequences often decrease. Yet Skinner also discovered something even more powerful than consistent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement, in which rewards appear unpredictably, often produces behaviors that become remarkably persistent. This principle helps explain why uncertainty can become psychologically consuming. When a person never knows whether today's interaction will bring affection or criticism, approval or rejection, the mind becomes increasingly focused on detecting even the smallest clues that might predict the outcome. This constant monitoring gradually changes perception itself. Instead of experiencing the relationship with openness and confidence, the individual begins scanning the environment for warning signs. Every conversation becomes something to decode. Every facial expression carries potential meaning. Every pause in communication invites interpretation. The person's attention narrows until emotional surveillance becomes almost automatic. They are no longer simply participating in the relationship. They are attempting to predict it. This process resembles what psychologists describe as hypervigilance, a state of heightened awareness that develops in response to repeated stress or perceived threat. Hypervigilance is not simply excessive worrying. It reflects a nervous system that has learned to remain prepared for danger because experience has taught it that danger may appear without warning. While hypervigilance is associated with several psychological conditions and is not specific to narcissistic relationships, the concept helps explain how prolonged interpersonal instability can reshape emotional experience. Within certain narcissistic relationship dynamics, unpredictability often becomes a defining feature. The partner may receive affection one day and criticism the next. Ordinary disagreements may suddenly escalate into personal attacks. Yesterday's compliment may be followed by today's humiliation. The rules governing the relationship seem to change without explanation. What produced approval last week may produce anger today. From the outside, this inconsistency appears confusing. From the perspective of the nervous system, however, inconsistency demands constant attention. Whether intentional or not, unpredictable interpersonal environments naturally encourage emotional sensitization. The individual begins paying closer attention because the cost of missing an emotional signal feels increasingly high. A subtle change in mood now matters. A brief delay in responding to a message becomes significant. Small behavioral cues that once passed unnoticed gradually assume enormous psychological importance. The threshold for emotional reaction becomes lower because the nervous system has learned that seemingly minor events sometimes precede major consequences. Albert Bandura's work on social learning offers another important insight. Human beings do not learn only through direct experience. They also learn by observing the reactions of others. Emotional responses spread through families, friendships, and social groups. When one person's interpretations are repeatedly reinforced by those around them, those interpretations gain psychological credibility. This becomes particularly important in environments where uncertainty already exists, because people naturally seek external confirmation when they doubt their own perceptions. From this perspective, emotional manipulation becomes more sophisticated than simple intimidation. Rather than demanding obedience directly, the environment itself begins shaping emotional expectations. The target starts anticipating criticism before criticism occurs. They apologize before accusations are made. They defend themselves before anyone has openly challenged them. Eventually, the nervous system begins reacting not only to actual conflict, but also to the possibility of conflict. Fear moves from specific situations into the background architecture of everyday life. This shift produces a profound psychological consequence. The person's emotional threshold gradually changes. Events that once would have seemed ordinary now produce disproportionate anxiety because the nervous system has learned that ordinary events sometimes conceal extraordinary consequences. A simple question may feel like an interrogation. A neutral expression may appear disapproving. Silence may be interpreted as rejection. These reactions often puzzle both the individual and those around them because they seem excessive when viewed in isolation. Yet viewed as the cumulative result of repeated conditioning, they become far easier to understand. This may explain why some people leave psychologically unhealthy relationships feeling as though they have become different versions of themselves. Friends notice that they startle more easily. Family members observe that they seem unusually defensive. Everyday decisions become emotionally exhausting because every interaction carries the possibility of hidden conflict. The individual often concludes that something is fundamentally wrong with their personality. A different interpretation may be more accurate. Their nervous system has adapted to an environment in which heightened sensitivity increased the chances of emotional survival. This brings us to the central question of this essay. If repeated unpredictability can gradually lower a person's emotional threshold, what role does that process play within narcissistic relationship dynamics? More importantly, why might a highly reactive partner become advantageous within such a system? To answer that question, we must move beyond individual psychology and examine the social environment surrounding the relationship. Because in many cases, the conditioning of the target does not occur in isolation. It is reinforced by other people who may not even realize the role they are playing. Part 2. The social reinforcement of hypersensitization. If repeated unpredictability can gradually lower a person's emotional threshold, Another question naturally follows. Why does the process so often extend beyond the relationship itself? Why do friends, family members, co-workers, or members of a social circle sometimes appear to reinforce the same emotional environment? Within discussions of narcissistic abuse, these individuals are commonly referred to as flying monkeys, a popular term borrowed from fiction rather than a clinical diagnosis. Although the label is informal, it describes a phenomenon that has long interested psychologists. Human beings rarely influence one another alone. Social groups often become part of the process, sometimes intentionally and sometimes without realizing it. At first glance, this can seem confusing. Why would someone participate in another person's manipulation? Why would an otherwise reasonable individual repeat accusations they never witnessed, defend behavior they never experienced, or dismiss another person's concerns without carefully examining the evidence? It is tempting to assume malicious intent, but psychology often offers more ordinary explanations. Most people believe they are acting reasonably. They interpret events through the information available to them, and that information is frequently incomplete. Albert Bandura's work on social learning demonstrated that people learn not only from direct experience, but also by observing others. We watch how people react. We notice which behaviors receive approval and which invite criticism. Over time, these observations shape our own responses. This process begins in childhood and continues throughout adult life. Human beings are deeply social creatures. We constantly use other people as reference points when deciding what is true, acceptable, or dangerous. This tendency becomes especially powerful when one individual presents a confident and emotionally persuasive narrative. Confidence is often mistaken for accuracy. Repetition is frequently mistaken for evidence. A story told with certainty can become remarkably convincing even when important facts are missing. Once several people begin accepting that narrative, others may follow simply because the growing consensus appears to confirm its validity. This principle was famously demonstrated by Solomon Asch. In his conformity experiments, participants knowingly gave incorrect answers about simple visual tasks after hearing an entire group provide the same incorrect response. The findings revealed something uncomfortable about human psychology. Many people will question their own perceptions before questioning the agreement of a group. Consensus exerts a powerful influence on judgment, even when the evidence directly before one's eyes suggests something different. Within unhealthy relationship systems, this creates fertile ground for reinforcement. If the target is repeatedly described as unstable, overly emotional, difficult, or impossible to satisfy, those descriptions may gradually become accepted by people who have never independently evaluated the situation. The group's agreement becomes evidence in itself. Instead of asking whether the description is accurate, individuals begin asking why so many people seem to believe it. This social reinforcement has profound psychological consequences for the target. Emotional experiences that were once private suddenly become public. Doubts that might have remained internal are now echoed by other voices. The target begins hearing the same themes repeated by friends, relatives, co-workers, or members of the community. The repetition creates an illusion of objectivity. If enough people are saying the same thing, perhaps it must be true. Yet repetition does not necessarily establish truth. It often establishes familiarity. The human brain naturally becomes more comfortable with ideas it encounters repeatedly, a phenomenon psychologists sometimes describe as the illusory truth effect. Statements repeated often enough begin to feel credible simply because they are familiar. Familiarity can easily be mistaken for accuracy, particularly when emotions are already running high. Stanley Milgram's research on obedience introduced another important insight. His experiments suggested that ordinary people are capable of participating in behaviors they would normally reject when they perceive those behaviors as supported by legitimate authority. Although personal relationships differ greatly from laboratory settings, the underlying principle remains relevant. Individuals frequently defer to the person they perceive as more confident, more knowledgeable, or more socially influential. The assumption is rarely stated aloud. It simply develops through repeated interaction until one person's interpretation becomes the default explanation for everyone else. This dynamic helps explain why some third parties become active participants without recognizing the role they are playing. They are not necessarily trying to harm anyone. They believe they are defending a friend, supporting a family member, preserving harmony within a group, or protecting someone they perceive as vulnerable. Their actions make sense within the narrative they have accepted. Because they view themselves as acting morally, they seldom question whether their participation may be contributing to someone else's psychological distress. There is another factor that often receives less attention. Social groups naturally discourage dissent. Challenging a widely accepted narrative carries personal risk. The individual who asks difficult questions may become isolated, criticized, or viewed with suspicion. Remaining silent often feels safer than questioning the group. Agreeing with the dominant perspective requires far less emotional effort than standing apart from it. Irving Janis described a related process through his work on groupthink. When preserving agreement becomes more important than critically examining evidence, groups often stop evaluating alternative explanations. Members begin reinforcing one another's assumptions while gradually dismissing information that challenges the prevailing narrative. The result is not necessarily deliberate deception. It is a narrowing of perspective. Once the group's conclusions become emotionally important, contradictory evidence is increasingly ignored or reinterpreted to preserve consensus. For the target, this social environment dramatically intensifies emotional conditioning. The relationship is no longer the only source of uncertainty. The surrounding community begins reinforcing the same emotional themes. Every conversation carries the possibility of invalidation. Every interaction becomes another opportunity to question one's own perceptions. The target starts anticipating criticism not only from one individual, but from an entire network of relationships. Hypersensitization expands beyond the original relationship and begins shaping the person's experience of the broader social world. This process also creates a dangerous feedback loop. As the target becomes increasingly anxious and emotionally reactive, those reactions are often interpreted as confirmation of the group's original beliefs. The person who has spent months or years navigating emotional unpredictability may eventually appear defensive, suspicious, or overly sensitive. Observers see the reaction but rarely witness the conditioning that produced it. The consequence becomes mistaken for the cause. Perhaps the most effective form of manipulation is one that persuades other people to participate without recognizing they are participating at all. When reinforcement comes from multiple directions, the target begins losing confidence in their own judgment. Their attention shifts away from evaluating reality and toward managing other people's perceptions. Emotional energy becomes consumed by explaining, defending, and anticipating rather than simply living. Whether these dynamics arise intentionally or gradually through ordinary social processes, the psychological effect can be remarkably similar. The target's nervous system becomes increasingly organized around the expectation of criticism, misunderstanding, and emotional threat. Every new interaction is filtered through the lessons of previous experiences. The individual is no longer reacting only to the present moment. They are reacting to an accumulated history of reinforcement that has reshaped the way the world itself is perceived. This brings us to the final stage of the process. What happens after months or even years of living in this emotionally conditioned environment? How does the nervous system adapt, and why do many people continue reacting long after the original relationship has ended? To answer those questions, we must examine what sustained hypersensitization does to the mind, the body, and ultimately a person's sense of reality itself. Conclusion: when the nervous system learns to expect danger. By the time hypersensitization has taken hold, something profound has changed. The individual is no longer reacting only to another person's behavior. The nervous system itself has been altered by repeated experience. What once required a major emotional event now requires only a subtle cue. A change in tone, a delayed response, an unfamiliar facial expression, or a brief moment of silence may trigger the same emotional alarm that once required open conflict. The relationship may have changed, or it may have ended entirely, yet the body continues behaving as though the original environment still exists. This is one of the most misunderstood consequences of prolonged psychological stress. Observers often assume the individual is simply overreacting. They see the emotional response, but not the conditioning that produced it. They witness the heightened sensitivity without recognizing that sensitivity developed gradually through hundreds or even thousands of repeated experiences. No one questions why a smoke detector becomes responsive to smoke. Yet when the human nervous system becomes increasingly responsive to emotional danger, people often mistake adaptation for weakness. From an evolutionary perspective, this adaptation makes sense. The brain is designed to recognize patterns that increase the chances of survival. When a particular environment repeatedly produces emotional pain, humiliation, rejection, or conflict, the nervous system becomes increasingly efficient at identifying anything that resembles those earlier experiences. This efficiency is protective under genuine threat. The difficulty arises when the protective system begins operating long after the original circumstances have changed. Psychologists often describe this process through the concept of hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is not simply heightened awareness. It is a state in which the brain continually searches for potential danger, even during moments that should feel safe. Attention becomes drawn toward possible threats rather than ordinary experiences. Neutral situations are evaluated for hidden meaning. Ambiguous behavior is interpreted cautiously because the cost of overlooking danger has become psychologically significant. Attachment theory provides another useful perspective. John Bowlby proposed that early relationships help shape internal working models that influence expectations throughout life. Although attachment patterns develop through many different experiences and cannot be reduced to a single relationship, repeated emotional unpredictability during adulthood may reinforce expectations that other people are fundamentally inconsistent, rejecting, or emotionally unsafe. Once those expectations become established, every new relationship begins carrying the emotional weight of previous ones. The consequence is not merely anxiety, it is a gradual transformation of perception itself. The individual begins interpreting the present through the lens of accumulated experience. They no longer encounter each interaction as something entirely new. Instead, every conversation is unconsciously compared with hundreds of earlier conversations. Every disagreement is measured against previous conflicts. Every silence is evaluated according to what silence has meant before. The nervous system becomes less interested in what is actually happening than in what similar situations once predicted. This is why recovery often proves far more difficult than leaving the relationship itself. Physical distance does not immediately erase psychological conditioning. The environment may have changed, yet the nervous system continues operating according to rules learned over months or years. Many people become frustrated because they believe they should already feel better. They wonder why ordinary interactions continue producing extraordinary emotional responses. The answer may be that conditioning rarely disappears as quickly as the circumstances that created it. There is another consequence that deserves careful attention. As the target becomes increasingly reactive, other people may begin responding to that reactivity rather than to the original source of distress. Friends notice anxiety, coworkers notice defensiveness, family members notice emotional exhaustion. Because they often lack the full history of conditioning, they interpret these behaviors as personality traits rather than adaptive responses. The target slowly acquires a reputation that reflects the consequences of prolonged stress instead of the person they were before that stress began. This misunderstanding can become deeply isolating. The individual feels unseen because everyone is responding to the symptoms rather than the process that produced them. Attempts to explain the experience are frequently dismissed as excuses or exaggerations. The more intensely the individual tries to communicate what has happened, the more emotionally reactive they appear. Ironically, the effort to regain credibility may further undermine credibility in the eyes of others. This creates one of the most self-reinforcing cycles in unhealthy relationship systems. The target's heightened sensitivity produces visible emotional reactions. Those reactions become evidence for people who already believe the individual is unstable or overly emotional. That interpretation increases social invalidation, which further heightens stress and emotional vigilance. The cycle begins feeding itself. Each stage appears to confirm the previous one while obscuring the underlying process that set everything in motion. The important insight is that emotional reactivity should not always be interpreted as evidence of irrationality. Sometimes it is evidence of learning. The human nervous system has remarkable capacity to adapt, and adaptation is not inherently healthy or unhealthy. It simply reflects the brain's effort to increase survival within a particular environment. The same mechanisms that help soldiers survive combat or help children navigate unpredictable households may also become active within chronically unstable relationships. What differs is not the learning process itself, but the circumstances that shaped it. This perspective also challenges a common misunderstanding about resilience. Many people assume resilience means never becoming affected by difficult experiences. Psychology suggests something different. Resilience involves the ability to recover, reorganize, and gradually establish new patterns after adversity. A nervous system that has become hypersensitized is not permanently damaged. It has learned one set of expectations through repeated experience. Given sufficient safety, consistency, and healthy relationships, it can gradually learn different expectations. Recovery is possible because learning is not a one-time event. The brain continues adapting throughout life. Perhaps the most important lesson is that awareness interrupts automaticity. Conditioning exerts its greatest influence when it remains invisible. Once people begin recognizing the patterns that shape their emotional responses, they gain the opportunity to examine those responses rather than simply obey them. They begin distinguishing genuine, present danger from echoes of past experience. They learn that not every silence predicts rejection, not every disagreement signals abandonment, and not every criticism threatens their identity. The nervous system slowly discovers that safety can become predictable again. It is equally important to avoid extending this model too broadly. Not every emotionally reactive person has experienced narcissistic manipulation. Not every difficult relationship produces hypersensitization, and not every conflict reflects deliberate psychological conditioning. Human behavior is extraordinarily complex. Biology, personality, childhood experiences, social environments, and countless other influences shape the way individuals respond to stress. The framework presented in this essay represents one possible way of understanding certain patterns described within psychology and discussions of narcissistic relationship dynamics. It should encourage careful observation rather than simplistic conclusions. This brings us back to the question that opened the essay. Why would a highly reactive target matter within an unhealthy relationship dynamic? Because a person whose emotional threshold has gradually been lowered becomes increasingly predictable. They devote more attention to monitoring the relationship. They spend more energy anticipating conflict. They become easier to influence because so much of their psychological life revolves around avoiding the next emotional injury. Whether this outcome develops through deliberate manipulation or through the cumulative effects of instability, the result is remarkably similar. The relationship begins organizing the person's emotional world. The greatest danger is not that someone temporarily becomes more sensitive. The greatest danger is that they begin believing heightened vigilance is simply who they are. They mistake adaptation for identity. They conclude they have become weak, irrational, or fundamentally broken, when in reality, their nervous system has been responding exactly as nervous systems are designed to respond under sustained uncertainty. Understanding this distinction changes everything. If the heightened sensitivity was learned, it can also be unlearned. If the nervous system was shaped by repeated experience, new experiences can gradually reshape it again. The emotional alarms that once seemed impossible to silence need not define the future. They are evidence of a brain that adapted to survive, not evidence of a person incapable of healing. The deepest consequence of psychological manipulation may not be that it changes what a person believes. It may be that it changes what their nervous system expects. Once expectation itself has been conditioned, the world begins to feel dangerous even when danger is absent. Yet the same capacity for learning that allowed hypersensitization to develop also makes recovery possible. The mind that learned fear can also learn safety, and the nervous system that once adapted to instability can, with time and consistent experience, rediscover what it feels like to live without constantly waiting for the next threat.